Fantastic. Hello and welcome to Level 2, Session 5 of the Berklee Music Education and Special Needs Study Group. You are in for a treat. We have Krista Jadro with us. She will be presenting on music learning theory, and then I'm going to do a session on special education strategies that apply and map easily onto music education. So before that, I'm going to run through logistics. This is now our 5th session. If you're going once a week, once a time slot. So you're very familiar with these logistics, but just so everybody's on the same page in all ways, we're going to pass over my introductions because you know about those. This is our synchronous session schedule, and you can see that we are at Saturday, May 1st. We had our 2 sessions with Victoria Laricia earlier today. And this afternoon, we'll be hearing from Krista Jadro and then from me. As you know, on Monday, I will send out links to the recordings, as well as all of the slides and any additional materials for the sessions, the link to the between session engagement Google document, all those things, so that you'll be able to stay up to date and so that our asynchronous folks are able to access the materials. So in order to participate fully in the study group, you have to meet the following requirements. Attendance at least 18 hours of sessions. That means they could be all level 1 sessions. They could be all level 2 sessions. They could be a mixture, doesn't matter. You can attend more than 18. Fantastic, go for it, knock yourself out. But we've got to get at least 18. Your participation can be synchronous or asynchronous or a mixture of both. So we have access to all of that. You also need to do the Google documents for the between session engagement after each session. And those are always sent out. Links to those are sent out the Monday following the session. So we're tracking participation along those as well. And then you are to create and present a project, which we've been talking about, and I'll go over that again today. We're going to send out certificates of participation in multiple shifts. We will do one big shift shortly after all of the synchronous sessions have happened. So 2 weeks from now on May 15th is our last synchronous session day. Not long after that, the first set of certificates will go out. And those will be for people who've completed all of these requirements by then. But we are well aware that there are some folks with asynchronous participation who are taking longer to get through. And so we're going to make sure that we send out a second shift a little later and then even a third shift later than that. And we will stay informed as to people's levels of participation. So what is a project? We've been talking about this since day 1, but it is an application of some aspect of something you're learning in this study group in a meaningful way applied to your own teaching situation. Wide range of possibilities here, and we have that project ideas Google Doc that people have been sharing ideas. Lots and lots of different things that you can do, creating curriculum, developing adaptations, assessments, doing a case study, trying something new, lots and lots of different things. The big important headline is that projects are works in progress. We have 12 weeks together. It is absolutely unrealistic to expect a fully formed, tied on a bow, neat, perfect project in 12 weeks' time. We know this. So what it more is here's something that I'm adapting or I'm moving into my practice. Here's where I am with it now, the snapshot of where it is in progress, right? And you may be able to talk about your plans for the future with it, but we're expecting the project to really be a snapshot. Depending on what the project is, will depend on what the deliverable looks like. What you create to document your project depends on what the project is. We're going to spend the May 15th sessions, it will be myself and Vicky Laricia, giving feedback to people's projects. And I'm making an addendum to this slide because in prior years, we've had people do presentations of their projects that are under 10 minutes. We're now going shorter to under 5 minutes. There's a lot of us, which is awesome. It's a great problem to have. But in order to make sure we hear from everybody, we're going to keep these presentations short. It really might be, here's what I'm interested in, and here's a really quick snapshot of one aspect of what I did. Going through everything you did for that project is probably going to take too long. So please don't expect to share everything with us. And please don't expect to spend 10 minutes. We're looking for under 5 minutes of some way of sharing. It can be you talking, and I can, in the webinar format, find you and give you video and audio so that you can be heard and seen. It could be a little quick thing that you have to show us, and I will make sure that screen sharing is available, but it's going to be short. And the reason for that is we want to fit everybody in. We've got 2 3-hour sessions, and we want to fit everybody in. In addition, there are going to be asynchronous folks who are unable to attend either of the sessions in 2 weeks. And I'm going to have a Google Drive folder, you'll get the link on Monday, for folks who need to submit their projects there because they are not able to be here with us. And in that case, I'm going to look at them in advance and be able to share real quick, under 5 minutes, something so that all of us can see it, and also so that Vicki and I can give feedback on it. So very, very short presentations. We've been thinking about the projects all along. We had that project ideas Google Doc, which has been very, very well populated. I know that as you try these things and as you experience more and more learning in the study group, your project changes. There is no need to update that project ideas document. That is not the purpose of that document. The purpose of that document was to help us flesh out and think about ideas, make sure no one's trying to do too much or too many things, right? So you're going to share what you have, a snapshot, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about how this learning is making a difference already in what you do. We all know this. We go to all kinds of conferences and mini courses and professional development. And what makes that learning meaningful is not only the experience of the learning, but immediately putting something into practice, making a connection to your work immediately. So that's what this is about. So that is the end of my logistical presentation for the morning, or I should say afternoon. And I'm going to turn it over to Krista. Krista is getting her video on right now. And I know she's going to introduce herself to you. But I will say that Krista has been working with us at the Berklee Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs for quite some time as a consultant, probably since maybe 2014.
I think so. It's about that.
And her big area of focus has been consulting with us for our music classes for young children. Krista, you will be really happy to know that we moved that program completely remote with everything else we've been doing remotely. We sent our families little gift bags of unpitched percussion instruments and scarves and some different things to work with, and that we have one big section that meets online, taught by Miles and Nadia, who have been doing it since the very beginning.
Yeah.
And it is incredible what they're able to do online. I go and visit the class most Saturdays, and it's amazing to see how well that particular class has adapted to Zoom and how engaged and excited all the families and children are. So
that's great.
They're carrying the legacy into Zoom, which is really fantastic.
Absolutely.
Terrific. So I'm going to turn it over to Krista, who has an awful lot to share with all of you. Take it away, Krista.
All right. Thank you, Rhoda. So I wanted to start today with a little bit of an MLT, which is short for music learning theory warm up. So move with me. It's after lunch here, so movement feels really good. So move with me. We're going to move our shoulders in circles and listen to my song. Move your head in circles. Bum 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 sing that with me? Bum. I'm going to sing my song. Whenever I stop my song, we're all going to sing. Bum. Bum, 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 ba-dum. Bum. Bum, 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 ba-dum. Bum. Ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum. How about our elbows in circles? Bum, 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 ba-dum. Bum, 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 ba-dum. Ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum. Bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, bum. Can you sing? Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum, bum. And one more time, maybe we'll just stretch this time. Bum, 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 ba-dum. Bum, 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 ba-dum. Ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum. Bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum. So we just turned on our tonal audiation a little bit. Let's turn on some rhythmic audiation. This time I have a beanbag, but you can pretend you have a beanbag. I'm going to place it on my hand. So pretend you're feeling the weight of the beanbag on your hand. And we're just going to give it a ride through the air. Repeat after me. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. I'm gonna put the beanbag on my head. Pretend you have a beanbag on your head and move it around. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. I'm going to keep the microbeats very lightly. Ba, 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 ba. Keep that go. Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. Now the macrobeats. So you might have guessed, or maybe you hear, maybe you can audiate that the macrobeats are a little bit unusual. Pick some tricky things to audiate this afternoon. So we have ba, 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 ba. So that was Swinging, the Dorian song I sang first, and that's from the Music Moves for Piano curriculum. And then that chant was Buggy Ride, and that's from the Music Playbook, which is an MLT early childhood method book. So hello and welcome. I'm just going to share my screen now that our warm-up is through. Here we go. I'm so glad to be here today, and I want to thank Rhoda for inviting me to the study group to talk about music learning theory with students with disabilities. There is a Q&A on here, so if you have any questions as I'm talking, I should be able to see if you put it in the Q&A. It's a little harder for me to moderate the chat as well. So if you know how to do the Q&A, I think that might be the best choice for me, just to be able to see what you guys are doing or asking. And then I also have a handout. Let's see if I can get to the chat here. Here we go. And I can put in my handout right on the chat if you would like to follow along. So my name is Krista Jadro. I'm the owner of Music Learning Academy, which offers online courses and resources and workshops for teachers that are interested in audition-based piano instruction and music moves for piano. I teach early childhood music and piano, group piano at Brookline Music School, which is right outside of Boston. And I also directed their early childhood and group piano program for a number of years as well. I'm certified by the Gordon Institute for Music Learning in piano, early childhood, and general music, and I'm also on the Gimel piano faculty. For 6 years, I taught at schools for students with autism. They were ages 3 through 21. It was right after I completed my graduate assistantship at University of Delaware, where my passion for music learning theory really began. When I started teaching at these schools, I dove in head first with MLT, with music learning theory. And I did get a few strange looks because if you know music learning theory, there are a few core activities that might look different. Lots of singing and chanting with neutral syllables like we just did, chanting rhythm patterns, singing tonal patterns, lots of continuous fluid movement. The students and the teachers were not used to this when I first got to that school, but during the 6-year journey there, some amazing, amazing things happened. After 6 months of instruction during my first year, the principal cried to me. Tears were coming down her face at our concert because she didn't know that the students were capable of musicking, of making music, of understanding music the way that they did. They were playing instruments in ensembles, playing rhythm patterns on drums, singing together. And they were showing that they were really starting to understand musical syntax. Also, behaviors in my classroom were very, very minimal. Right? They were rarely a problem. And I think because just the environment that was set with this really calming type neutral syllables, songs and chants and folk dancing that we did, they were really not too overstimulating. And the teachers and students really enjoyed them. And one of my highlights was during a talent show. I think this was about my 4th or 5th year. And I had a group of students that played a blues piece together. There were 3 different non-pitch percussion parts, 3 different xylophone parts, and a singer. And I was able to start them like a jazz band, 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and then I walked away. I was able to walk away to the side as they performed all these different parts together. And these were students that had trouble holding a conversation with somebody, yet they were able to listen to one another and make music together. I think that was one of my highlights during that time at that school. I really put trust in the learning sequence that is laid out in music learning theory when I was there, and it led to students that were auditing, they were understanding music, and we were all having a truly amazing time together. So we moved to Boston in 2013, and unfortunately I had to leave that job, but I was thrilled to meet Rhoda, as she said, in 2014 and become a consultant for the music classes for young children. I also taught at a local preschool classes for students with autism, and also started a program with music therapist Adrian Flight called Piano for All Children at Brookline Music School. So we have a little over an hour today, and these are topics that I could spend all weekend on, or actually probably more than just all weekend on. So I'm going to do my best to give you an overview and enough information so that you want to learn more. That's really my goal. I want to give you enough information that you say, okay, I think this can help my students. I think I can use this in my classroom. I'm going to go out and learn more. So today we're going to cover music learning theory. That's going to be kind of my talking part of it. And then we'll do some tonal activities together for audiation, some rhythm activities for audiation, and then at the end, if we have any time for questions. But again, you can always put a question in the Q&A as well. So let's get started with music learning theory. And before we get started with music learning theory, I did want to mention that the activities that we're going to go over, the tonal and rhythm, I try to pick activities that you can include in your classroom no matter what level that you're teaching at. And with your students with disabilities, if you're early childhood or elementary general or band or orchestra or choral, the activities we're going to go over today will be applicable in all of those situations. So let's start. Music learning theory. Music learning theory, which is often referred to as MLT, is an explanation of how we learn when we learn music. Now, what does it mean to learn music? This is where MLT kind of turned my life upside down about 20 years ago, because I had always thought learning music was what I did, was reading music and then playing it. And those people that could play by ear and just kind of sit down at their instrument and just go, I figured, well, they had a special talent. I could never do that. That was something that they were born with. But when I started to learn what children, what adults, what we are truly capable of doing when we are taught how we learn, I was captivated. That was it. It was MLT for me after that. I saw videos of 5-year-olds, and you're going to see one, 5-year-olds improvising in multiple tonalities and meters, tonalities that I didn't even understand yet when I was introduced to this at about 18. Fourth graders improvising over the blues progression, middle school jazz bands playing by ear without a conductor, keeping a steady beat, playing in tune and improvising. I now have 7-year-old students in my piano studio that learn to sing a melody, and then they just say, can I go play it? And then they go to the piano and they play it, and then they put the bass line and the chords and create an accompaniment and an introduction and all of these things, because music is just like a language to them. They understand it. It becomes a part of them. And this is something that we can guide all of our students to do by knowing how music is learned. So Edwin Gordon is the man responsible for music learning theory. He was a researcher, an author, a teacher, an editor, a lecturer, an outstanding musician. I don't have that on the slide, but he was. And I'm honored to have had the opportunity to learn from him before he passed away in 2015. And today I want to highlight 3 main ideas from music learning theory. First, of course, you've probably heard of audiation. I feel like audiation has become somewhat of a buzzword in recent years, and I've seen it defined as hearing music in our heads or aural imagery or even aural perception, but there really is more to it. And I'm excited to talk about it today to you all and hopefully clearly define it for you. Audiation is the cognitive process that brings understanding to music that we listen to, perform, create, read, and write. So we're audiating when we're doing any of these with music. If we're listening to music, if we're performing, singing, chanting, or playing our instrument, when we're creating or improvising, and when we're reading or writing music notation. And this is just like how we use thought to bring understanding to words that we listen to, that I'm speaking, you're listening right now, you're understanding what I'm saying. When we're speaking, we're using thought, communicating, and reading and writing. So audiation is different than hearing music in our heads. I can memorize a tune, sing it silently in my head, but not really understand its tonal and rhythm elements or its harmonic structure. Audiation is different than oral imagery, which to me implies visualizing something, seeing something, such as maybe visualizing music notation. Audiation is different than aural perception, which is hearing music the moment it is produced, regardless of understanding. So if I were to say, dober dan, kakosi, you hear me, right? You're orally perceiving what I'm saying. If I wrote it out for you, you could read it, you can sound it out and read it. But chances are, unless you speak Croatian, which I don't, but I have family that do, you didn't understand what I said. Now, if I said it a couple times, dober dan, kako si? Dober dan, kako si? I bet you could say it. I bet you can think it if I say it. Dober dan, kako si? But that still doesn't help you to understand what I said. And then I'm saying, good day, how are you? So let's think about that in musical terms now. If I were to sing, bum, 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 bum. And I bet you either audiated or you sang the last tone of that song. It was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, last tone, bum. But what else are you audiating when I sing that? Bum, 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 bum. Chances are, now that I left off the resting tone that previous time, you're probably audiating the resting tone. Bum. Are you audiating the tonality? It's major tonality. Do, mi, so, mi, do. Are you audiating the meter? Are you feeling do, day, do, day, do, day, do, day? Those are all things that we can audiate when we're listening. Can you audiate the bass line? Bum, 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 bum. So we know it as harmonized by tonic, subdominant, and dominant. And then if we take audiation a step further, and these are things that students can do at 8 and 9 years old, can we improvise a melody over that bass line? Bum, 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 bum. And take it another step further. Are we familiar with more tonalities? Can we change it? Bum, 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 bum. That was Twinkle, Twinkle in Phrygian. Gives a very different feel. Or are we familiar with other meters to change it? You can change it to triple meter or something unusual like we did before. Bum, 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 bum. So if those tonalities and the meters, if that's in your vocabulary, you can do things like that and change familiar melodies. And these are all just examples of audiation, but of course we're just scratching the surface. Now, what about the song and the chant that I did at the beginning of our session today? I purposely chose ones that you might not be as familiar with. They may not be part of your vocabulary. So the song, and you can write it in the chat. I'll look at the chat too. If you know what tonality the song was in. Bum, 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 ba-dum. Bum, 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 ba-dum. Ba-da-da-dum, bum, ba-da-da-dum. Bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum. So it wasn't quite major, it wasn't quite minor. That was Dorian. And I didn't understand Dorian for a very long time. I thought, well, it kind of sounds minor-ish. And I remember the moment after I was acculturated to a whole lot that I just got it. All of a sudden, Dorian sounded completely different than it had its own properties and characteristics and sound. And now I can improvise and compose and play in Dorian. I could not do any of that when I was first introduced. The MLT sequence brought me to understanding. And then the chant that I did, that was in 7/8. So that was what we call an unusual meter. So our next main idea is music aptitude. And music aptitude is one's potential for learning music. And this is not to be confused with music achievement, which is what has already been learned. So we're not born knowing how to play an instrument, right? What we learn on our instrument, that would be music achievement. Music aptitude is innate. We're born with it. It can go down if we're not nurtured. It's nature and nurture. There are reliable tests that we can use to measure music aptitude, but really that's not the point that I want to make with music aptitude today. I wanted to include music aptitude because it's important to know that everybody has it. Oops, wrong button. There we go. Everyone has the potential to learn music. And this was my foundation. This was my firm belief that supported my teaching actions, especially when I went into that school with students with autism, that every one of my students that I saw, and I saw a lot there, I firmly believe that they all had the potential to learn music. And if I stuck with the sequence and I was able to assess and work with them and individualize my instruction to each one of those students, then they could learn music at their own pace. Now, my third main idea is sequence. I just talked about sequence. Students are going to learn how to audiate through a sequence of informal guidance and formal instruction. So the best way to describe the sequence of how students learn music really is to compare it to how one learns language. And when we're learning language, we have 5 vocabularies that are developed: listening, speaking, thinking, conversing, reading, and writing. The listening vocabulary is developed first, and really that's the foundation. That's the foundation of our language learning. It begins as soon as a child can hear in utero. It's all about absorption. The process begins when one hears the sound of the language and the inflection of the speaking voice, and eventually they develop the ability to identify and to discriminate sounds, to build a vocabulary of words. And that's important. It's not a vocabulary of individual letters or individual sounds. We build vocabularies of words that we're going to then use to communicate and read and write and speak. When a child is born, that's when the exploration of the sounds begin, which we call babbling, the beginning of the speaking vocabulary. As the child begins to discriminate the sounds they hear, they then begin to imitate the sounds. These sound imitations, they don't have any meaning at first. They might say mama, 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 but they're not really looking at the mama or meaning the mama. But eventually, children do break that code of language and begin to put those sounds together into words. And it's important to remember that there's not a set age that this happens. This is all a process. My daughter started talking at 9 months with the first word of kitty cat, and my son didn't start talking until 18 months. Neither of them stopped talking now, but they are following this process at their own pace. Now, the third vocabulary is thinking and conversing. And in this context, thought, the thinking, is the cognitive process that is going to give meaning to the words that are heard, that are spoken, that are read or written. So now we're attaching meaning to the words and using them for communication, for understanding what's being said to us, for communication of our own thoughts and wants and needs, to read stories or write poetry. And this thinking, conversing vocabulary starts very simply, right? A child may want something to drink, so they might just say milk, milk. But eventually, hopefully, it'll turn into, can I have some milk, please? So it's always growing. Students, or children, I should say, they're practicing. And conversing in this vocabulary is that communication with words. And finally, we have reading and writing. Children need a solid foundation of listening, speaking, and thinking and conversing, forming a really rich vocabulary of words that are understood and used. Without these vocabularies, reading and writing are severely limited and cannot be met with an ease of comprehension. And then informally, those final vocabularies, the reading and writing vocabularies, they begin very early, right? We read books to children, they might pretend to write, we bring awareness to letters and to sight words in print. And then formally, reading and writing, it's going to begin after years of developing those first 3 vocabularies, not until the students get into school in kindergarten and first grade. So now let's look at music learning. Again, just like language learning, we have 5 vocabularies. We have listening, performing, auditing, improvising, reading, and writing. And in that performing vocabulary, we can think about singing, chanting, and even playing an instrument as well. Just like language, listening is that foundation. The vocabulary develops when one absorbs the sounds of music, the sounds of the singing voice, inflections of rhythmic chanting, tonal and rhythm context, harmony. This is all absorbed, all absorbed. It's best developed in a music environment that's really rich, that includes songs in different tonalities, and chants and songs in different meters, lots of repetition, lots of patterns, tonal and rhythm patterns, and lots of movement like we were doing before. This gives the child or the student an opportunity to start to discriminate the sounds, to hear all those different sounds and put them together and start to form a vocabulary of tonal and rhythm patterns. And now remember, in language, we don't form a vocabulary of individual letters or individual sounds. We develop a vocabulary of words. And in music, we don't develop a vocabulary of individual notes or even individual intervals. We develop a vocabulary of patterns, tonal patterns and rhythm patterns. We learn those separately. We separate tonal and rhythm. And patterns are the words of music, and they really are necessary for audiation development. I have a little side note here about context and content, just something to keep in the back of your mind as you're hearing me talk about patterns and everything. Context is the whole. Okay, that's the tonality, that's the meter, and content is the part. Those are our words, right? The patterns. This is a tonal pattern. When we look at this pattern, we see a major tonal pattern. You might look at this, and if you use tonal syllables, you might think do, mi, so. But this can mean a lot of different things. Do, mi, so has many different meanings. If I do this, let's see. Bum, 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 bum. Do, mi, so, bum, 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 bum. I'm just kind of improvising with that. So that was do, mi, so, ba-da-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum, in major tonality. Now give me a second to change my audiation. Let's hear this pattern in a different way. Bum, 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 ba-da-dum, bum, bum. Do, mi, so, ba-da-dum, bum, 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 bum. Now listen for that do, mi, so, and I improvise again. Ba-da-da-da-dum, bum, 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 bum. Ba-da-da-da-dum, bum, bum, bum. Ba-da-da-da-dum, bum, bum. So that's why it's really important to establish our context when we're including patterns in our instruction. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but I just wanted that in the back of your mind. Context, in this case, our tonality, is going to give us this necessary information to audiate the content. So in major, we were audiating do, mi, so as our tonic. And in Dorian, we were audiating do, mi, so as our subtonic. Content, the patterns, then help us to bring understanding to the context. All right, on to the performing vocabulary. Now, similar to the speaking vocabulary of language, the performing vocabulary, which is singing or chanting or playing an instrument, begins with exploration and with babbling. One may vocalize pitches or short durations with random sounds or syllables as they explore the content of music. I teach piano, and on the piano, my beginners are always babbling with their playing, right? They're exploring the sounds of their instrument that they're going to begin to imitate as they become more comfortable with music. That's like a piano babble, I guess. And then eventually this babbling is going to turn to imitation. The child is going to start to imitate the sounds with still not really any meaning attached to it. So an imitation might sound like, if I go ba 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 ba, the child might go ba 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 ba. Okay, they're kind of getting it, but they're not coordinating. They're not bringing that understanding to it yet. But eventually, they're going to break the code. They're going to break the code of music. They're going to begin to sing in tune. They're going to be able to coordinate their body and their breath. They're going to be able to chant and play patterns, again, the words of music more accurately, and eventually with musical meaning and with coordination, which this is going to bring us to the ever so important auditing and improvising vocabularies. Audiation is to music what thought is to language, that cognitive process that brings meaning to the music that we're listening to, that we're singing and chanting, that we're creating and improvising, reading and writing. The ability to improvise not only demonstrates one understanding of music, but also cements what one has learned. We put it all together when we improvise. We use what we learn in our listening and performing vocabularies when we're improvising. And these begin very simply, maybe dialoguing with a teacher, singing a different tonal pattern, chanting a different rhythm pattern, or maybe playing a pattern on their instrument. However, just as in language, this is going to develop over time. When the students are given a chance to improvise and consistently improvise, it's going to develop, and they should be encouraged to be creative and explore the synthesis of musical sounds. I have a short clip of a student improvising. Just gotta rewind.
Number difference. Bum 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 bum. Bum 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 bum. Bum 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 bum. Thank you, Lucy. Oh, there we go. I go first here.
I accidentally clicked it, but that last one was a ba at the end. So that was my daughter Lucy when she was just 5 years old, improvising. I meant it to be harmonic minor. She went Aeolian, and then also in duple meter. And our next vocabularies are reading and writing. And you may have heard her and thought, okay, she's auditing musical syntax. She's singing in different tonalities. She's creating with duple meter. She must be ready to read and write. And I would say, not so fast, not so fast. Yes, she's understanding, right? She's bringing understanding. She's knowing how to audiate, but she doesn't know yet what she's audiating. So she went through informal guidance, like I mentioned before, to get to where she was in that clip. And then after that, we have formal instruction. So because she doesn't know what she's auditing. So when I look around, I can label things that I see. I can use my senses to label what I'm seeing, what I'm touching. This is a pencil, this is a beanbag, I have my water. I can say what I'm hearing with my senses. I hear my husband mowing the lawn outside. I told him not to come close though. You can label all these things. Now, music is an oral art, right? So we need to know how to audiate, do what Lucy was doing before we then put our labels on, before she starts to learn what she's audiating. So that clip was about 2 years ago. And now she knows how to label a lot of those things. She knows how to label, okay, I was chanting in duple meter. I was singing in minor tonality. I know that I have the tonic and the dominant, even though she could sing all those at that point. Now she's labeling them. And then once she's understanding what she's audiating, then we're going to be reading and writing. And paired with knowing what the student is audiating, it's also really important to know when abstract thinking begins. And that doesn't begin until 11 or 12. And that's when reading and writing music becomes much simpler. Because when you think of a rhythm pattern, I don't know if you have your handout handy, but when you think of a rhythm pattern, even if you look at a duple meter pattern here, ba, 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 that can be written in so many different ways. And if a child is thinking really concretely, that's not going to make sense to them. And I can see it in my students. I have a lot of students that are between 9 and 12, 13 years old. And at around 9, they still, I don't get it. I can show them 2 in rhythmic patterns, one maybe with a half note as the macrobeat, one with the quarter note as the macrobeat. and they don't get it. But then you wait a few years till around that 11 mark. Oh yeah, that's fine. And it flies. And then reading is a much different experience when they have the vocabulary, when they know what they're auditing, and when they develop that abstract thinking. So it's important to remember that MLT, music learning theory, is a theory. And it's a theory that can be applied in many educational settings and with other educational methods. So even if you're using an early childhood, elementary, general, band, orchestra, whatever method you're using already, there are activities that you can do to help guide your students to be able to audiate. And one of the things, I'll say it again, that I love about music learning theory is that you can individualize instruction. So if you have a group of students, of 25 students, of 5 students, at all different levels, you can individualize instruction within activities. And once you know the theory and the sequence, you have a tool to teach music learning that can be individualized for any student's success. I can have a group of 4 piano students, of 25 general music students, or 6 8-year-olds with autism. I've taught all those in the past. And in each of those settings with music learning theory, I can individualize, like I said, every activity to challenge them appropriately and to guide their musical development. So paired with all the tools that you are no doubt learning in this study group, I'm sure you're learning so much. MLT can be a powerful addition to lead your students to fulfilling the musical potential that they already have. So I'm going to remove this slideshow here. And we've got plenty of time for activities. And remember, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. I also, since now I'm not sharing my screen, I can have the chat up and I can look at the chat as well. So if anybody has any questions about what I've discussed so far, please feel free to put it in the Q&A or the chat. So I want to focus today on activities that you can all do in your settings. And if you want to actually go to the chat and let me know what your setting is, I would really love to know who I have and who I'm talking to today. So if you're early childhood or elementary general, band or orchestra, go ahead and write that in the chat. I would like to know. And whether you're teaching, whatever you're teaching, I hope you can use some of these activities today to guide your students to audiate, including, of course, any students with disabilities. And I'm going to go over some teaching tips at the end for supporting your students if they need any support. As I mentioned before, oh, great. So we have some elementary general and some early childhood. As I mentioned before, my goal for this webinar is to hopefully interest you to learn more, because it's really important for us to, as music educators, right? We're all music educators. It's really important for us to know how our students are learning music, how they learn music. So resting tone, and if you have the handout, these are on there too, if you'd like to take it out, and you can write some notes as well. I'm just going to read the chat quickly just so I know who I'm talking to. So we have some one-on-one sessions, some teaching piano, excellent, music therapy, some middle school, upper elementary, some high school. So I did teach students 3 through 21. And I did a lot of these activities with my older students as well. Music together specialists. Oh, excellent. Moderate and severe students with autism. Class teacher from 3 to 18. Great. I love this. Thank you so much for letting me know in the chat. We're going to start with resting tone. This can be done in any setting. And the resting tone is the tonal center to which the piece of music that you're singing or that you're playing gravitates. They're all going to, sometimes it changes, but they're all going to have that tonal center. And it's one of the first things that I have my students find when they're learning a new song. If I want to play anything by ear, the first thing I do is find the resting tone of the song. It's resting tone and then first pitch. Simple things, but they're so important. Resting tone is also going to help us find out what tonality we're hearing and what harmonies are being used with that melody. So there are two main activities that I do, and we're going to do this now with a folk song. It's called Latvian folk song. It's a minor folk song. So I'll sing it for you first. And it's important that we always move when we're singing. It has become second nature to me. I just always move when I hear somebody sing or if I'm singing. But even just a continuous movement, swaying, just not stopping. So move with me as you listen. Listen again and think about what the resting tone is. Can drop it in our hand. Can you sing that? So the first activity that I'm going to do is stopping my song like I did before, and then we'll all sing the resting tone together. I'm going to warn you, if you do this for the first time with your students, you may think they're going to get them right, but it is a hard thing to do the first time. Now, I talk about individualizing instruction. Here's a way that you can individualize instruction for this one. I'm going to stop 3 times again. And when I stop, we'll sing the resting tone together. I want you to mentally kind of think about, okay, which one was easiest? Which one was maybe like average? And which one was kind of hard? Here I go. So which one do we think was the easiest? Probably that first one, right? Because that first little phrase ended on the resting tone. For a student, that would be really important to hear. And then they can sing that same pitch. I would say the average was the one that ended on the dominant. That's typically pretty easy to audiate, maybe like average difficulty. And then the most difficult for a student that needs to be challenged. They really need to be thinking that resting tone, that auditing that resting tone, to get back there after that 4th degree of the scale. Ray, Ray, there was Ray. So one activity, lots of ways to individualize. Another thing that you can do with the resting tone, takes a little bit more practice, but is really great for auditing changes in harmony. Okay, so if you have a band program, they could all be humming this as you listen to the piece or you sing the melodies of the piece, or a choral program, anything that you're doing. Or if I saw some early childhood, this is so wonderful to have the parents, or if you have TAs in the room, do this as you're singing the song. It sets a really, really nice atmosphere. So I want you to just hum the resting tone as I sing the song. So you're going to hum the entire time. If you need to take a break, a breath, of course, take a breath. But just hum that resting tone and see what kind of changes in how you hear the melody. So I'll start you. Bum. So keep humming that bum. Ba da 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 da. Ba da 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 da. Ba da 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 dum bum. Ba da 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 dum. So many times humming the resting tone will really help to hear those chord changes. So 2 easy things you can do with any song or piece that your students are learning in their program. So what can we do though to support our students with that kind of activity with disabilities? So a lot of the time I used a prop for my turn, your turn. A lot of my students would try to sing with me instead of wait to hear what I was singing and then to sing it after. So we could do, and this works for patterns too, bum, bum. I also sing with every student when they have an individual turn. I sing with them first before I give them the chance to do it themselves. I want them to be able to hear them sing it with me, and I also want them to get it right. I really like errorless learning, so I'll sing it with them until I'm confident that they can sing it on their own. You can use a xylophone bar. I had those bars that were individual so that I could take it to any student in my class. When I taught at the school for students with autism, I had between 6 and 9 students in my class, and I would just wheel around on my chair and I would sing. And then for the students that couldn't vocalize, they could play it on a bar or a bell. I had bells too that I would hold. And then, as I mentioned before, you can sing with them, or if there's a TA or a parent in the room, they can sing as well. The important thing with TAs and parents singing is that you also allow time for silence, right? Even if a student cannot vocalize yet, because we don't want to have expectations, because lots of my students have broken any expectation that I have had with them. I have a story about that if we have time at the end. And make sure that they can sing on pitch. They can sing the resting tone accurately. But that would also be a great way to get your teachers and your parents in the room helping out with the resting tone activities. So tonal patterns are the words of music, right? And they're so important. This is what's going to help students to bring understanding to what they are singing, they're chanting, they're playing. And we're thinking whole part whole. Whole is that context, that tonality, because we're talking about tonal audition. So we want to be sure to set the whole before we do any patterns. That's really important. And I always go back to the whole too. So I'll do a song, patterns, and then go back to the song. And it's either the same song or a different song as long as it's in the same tonality. That's the important thing, because then those patterns are going to bring increased understanding to that whole. Okay, so I'm going to sing Latvian folk song again, and then I'll do some patterns afterwards. And I would like you to echo those patterns that outline the tonic and dominant functions. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, bum. Back to the whole. Ba-da-da-da-da. Bum, ba-da-da-da-da. Ba-da-da-da-da. Bum, ba-da-da-da-da. Bum, bum. Now in your handout, I did put some examples of some patterns in there. I have both major and harmonic minor. And I noticed this when I was looking over this last night, but the importance of context can be seen just in the patterns that I gave you, because if you look at your harmonic minor patterns and you cover that first one, bum, 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 they can be major. I just changed it to major. So setting that context beforehand is really important, because those patterns, depending on the context, the same pattern is going to sound different to the students based on the context. And I've tried this. I heard it from another teacher. I'm like, I don't know if I believe it. And I tried it with my students, and it was the same thing where I played a D on my piano. I set context to major tonality and I played it. Okay, I said, okay, guys, that was one. And then I set context to minor tonality. I played the same D and I asked them, was that the same or different? And many of the students said different, because they're auditing something so different. And you learn right along with the students when you do MLT, because I'm always learning. My audiation is progressing because I am teaching this way. But now if somebody tells me the resting tone is do or the resting tone is la, I hear different things for my do and my la. Even though I know they're the same pitch, because they're a different resting tone, something happens with my audiation that I hear something different. I hear something different when it's that way. So the same thing happens with our students when we consistently set context with our patterns. Now, patterns, of course, too, can be individualized, right? You can probably kind of guess which patterns might be easy and which patterns might be difficult. So with my students, if I have somebody that needs an easy pattern, I might do something like a bum bum, right? Just a, if we're in minor tonal, mi la bum bum, a dominant tonic. That might be an easy pattern. And maybe for a student with average aptitude, I might go bum bum bum. Okay, that might be like an average pattern. Maybe a difficult pattern, bum bum bum, because there's a big jump in there. It might be hard to sing. So you can individualize instruction, and you can do this in a more research-based way, looking into when your students are ready, if they're singing in tune and everything. You can look into Edwin Gordon's learning sequence activities, and he actually has a formal pattern instruction where the students learn what to audiate in a very specific sequence. And he has done lots of research, or he did lots of research to identify which patterns were easy, moderate, and difficult. So those also might help to kind of get an idea of how to individualize those patterns. And now a couple of important things to remember when you're doing patterns and when you're doing many of these activities. Responses are encouraged and they are not expected. For all of my students, when I was teaching the informal, when I first started audition-based learning, when I was in kind of that informal guidance mode, the responses were not expected. But I did give every student a chance to respond, as long as they were okay with it. And I think most of my students were okay with me coming over to sing them patterns. Whether I knew they can echo me vocally or not, I went over to them and I sang tonal patterns. I would use props for my turn, your turn. Again, there was, especially at the beginning when we were getting used to this, there was some singing when I was singing. So it took a little bit of practice with some students. So bum, 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 for the my turn, your turn. I throw patterns into every major and every minor song, and it can be as easy as just doing a couple patterns. It doesn't have to be anything that's long or drawn out, or even if you do learning sequence activities, if you decide to go down that route with your students and more formal instruction, it's supposed to be maybe 5 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes at the beginning of your class. So it's not something that's going to take a long time to do. But research does show that it helps students to understand music when you practice the words of music. It brings more understanding to what they're hearing and what they're performing. But the way that you can throw patterns into a major or minor song is just what I did before. So if you are in early childhood or elementary general and you're singing a major song, whatever song that you're doing, I want you to just take a moment maybe and think of one major song that you did in class last week. And you can even write it in the chat. I'm sure I always do major songs too. I don't do all different tonalities, but if you can think of one major song that you did in your class last week, go ahead and write it in the chat. In fact, in one of my piano classes, I just did bottom, bum, bum, bottom, bottom, bum, 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 bum. And it can have words if you have words with your songs as well, sorry. Bottom, bum, bum, bottom, bum, 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 bottom, bum, bum, bottom. So 20 seconds, maybe that took to do a couple of tonal patterns in there. And that will bring, consistently doing things like that will bring more understanding to what the students are hearing. And singing tonal patterns will also help the students to sing in tune as well, as long as they're given individual time. So you might want to do it. Also, I wanted to say that students are not wrong with their responses. So if they echo something different, that's okay. Instead of correcting them, I don't correct the students, especially my younger students that I'm just starting with. I learn from it and it tells me what they need. So if I sing bum, 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 and they respond bum, 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 all right, they're close. I know they're imitating me and they have to learn how to coordinate their breath. So then I know what kind of activities to use to guide them there. I often try to refrain from using teach. I don't like to say that I teach my students. I guide. I know the sequence and I guide them to music learning, to music understanding, to be able to audiate. I know the sequence and I can guide them to what our goal is. For some students, if they respond with something different, I might ask, oh, was that the same or different? And then if they say that was the same and it wasn't, it's okay. I still learn from it. And I know that, okay, they're not hearing that. They need more exposure to this tonality, or they need more exposure to major tonal patterns and minor, because we need that contrast also to know what we're auditing. So that's going to bring me to another activity that you can do with your students, and that's just same or different. These are my same hands, and these are my different hands. So I might sing two tonal patterns. Bum, 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 bum. And I start really easy with two that are so obviously different, because if you get too hard too fast, then we start slow and then we get more difficult. And how about, here's one. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum, bum. Let's try one more. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum, bum. So a student might have said same on that one because they were very close and they kind of went in the same direction. And again, I don't correct, I learn from it. I'll always learn from their responses, and it shows me what they need more of, or maybe that something was too difficult and I need to back off a little bit, or if they're getting them all right, maybe they're not being challenged enough. So always learning from your students' responses. And then if you're doing same and different activities, you can also do this with songs that you're singing, right? So here's phrase one. Ba-dum, bum, bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum. Ba-dum, bum, bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum. And your students can show, oh, that was the same. Or some songs are the same in the beginning and they change the end. I was just teaching cuckoo to somebody, and I think it's bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum. Bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum. So we want them to hear that little difference, right? We want them to hear that difference. So with whatever songs you're doing, this is an easy activity, same or different, that you can do. Now, the final activities I should say, for tonal audiation, to turn on that tonal audiation, is to have contrast. So including songs and chants in different tonalities and different meters are going to provide a really rich musical experience. And it's also going to enhance tonal and rhythmic audiation, because we know what something is by what it's not. We're not going to know major duple if every song we sing is major and every song and chant we do is in duple meter. We have to have contrast. And the more contrast that you can provide for your students, the better they're going to audiate, the better they're going to be able to make comparisons with what they're hearing and to discriminate the sounds that they're hearing as well. So an example of just like a little activity time that you can do as a warm-up in whatever teaching situation that you are in. So let's pretend our arms are like falling leaves. And I'll do this. My oldest students are about 13 now, and we do activities like this all the time. And as you're listening, I have two more songs. Think about what tonalities they're in. Let's pretend we're pulling a rope. Bum, 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 ba-dum. Bum, 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 ba-dum. Ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum. Bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum. And let's stir with our body. So in that, I looked at the clock. That was 2 minutes. We did harmonic minor, and then Dorian, and then Mixolydian. So in a short time, we could just do a couple of movements. This can be done with any of your students, with disabilities. And if your students with disabilities or any of your students don't want to move, we never force it. We don't force the movement. It's okay, because as soon as a student becomes tense because they don't want to do something, then they're not listening anymore. So we don't want that to happen. So again, teaching to the individual student, knowing what they are willing to do, what they are comfortable doing. So before we move on to rhythm, I want you to take a minute, and you don't have to write it in the chat. You can write it on your notes, on a pad of paper, or on the handout. Take a minute, and I want you to jot down 2 tonal activities that you can do with your students in your teaching setting. And then also maybe an idea of how you can support your students with disabilities when you do that activity. And again, you can feel free to write it in the chat if you'd like to, and that might give some other teachers ideas as well. So go ahead and take a minute to do that, and then we'll move on to rhythm. All right, and if you have any questions about how to do one of these to your setting, feel free to ask. So rhythm, we want to start with flow. Okay, so flow is kind of the movements that we've been doing. A lot of times I'll do this standing up because I want to incorporate my whole body. So if you especially teach the younger students, you want them up, you want their hips moving, you can move your arms, and you want it to be continuous, so they're not stopping. If you have older students that are just not comfortable moving their body like that yet, that's okay too. You can roll your shoulders like we did in the warm-up, or even just tell them that it's a warm-up, right? We're just going to warm up our bodies before we play our instruments, or before we sing, or before we do, or you can pretend you're stirring something, anything to get your students moving continuously in an uninterrupted way, because this is how we feel the space in between beats. And again, if a student is dead set, they do not want to move, or they do not feel comfortable moving in this way, we don't make them. But if you flow around them, they will still feel that. So if you do that flowing movement, even if you don't want to do it really big, if you do this when you're singing to them, that is also going to help them. So it's feeling the space in between beats. And this is really important. If you have students that can't keep a steady beat, you move it back to flow. Move it back to these flowing movements. How about we swim? That's a nice flowing movement that can kind of trick those older elementary school students into doing some flow. Now flow can be free. So right now we're kind of moving in a free way, but can it also be bound? So now let's pretend we're swimming through honey. It's going to change our movement. So keeping in mind that free movement, or you can do whatever movement freely, and then you can do the same one in mud or in honey, or if you want to do it lightly, you can do it in cotton candy, or sometimes I have my students like swim or move through clouds for that light movement. And then we have patterns. And again, I included some on your handout just as a beginning. You don't have to just stick with those 4. But if this is new to you, I advise you to stick with the 4. Just use those patterns. If you're doing a duple meter song and you're like, okay, I want to do some patterns, do the ones in this handout, start there, and that's okay. That's going to start building a vocabulary for the students. And patterns can be 2 macrobeats or 4 macrobeats. So we could have ba, ba, ba would be a 2 macrobeat pattern. Another 2 macrobeat pattern would be ba, 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 or ba, 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 ba. These are all duple meter. Or ba, 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 ba. Those are all 2 macrobeats. And then a 4 macrobeat one, I always start with 2, and then I go to 4 as soon as the students are comfortable with 2. 4 would be ba, 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 ba. Or I'll read some from here. Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. And the last one is ba, 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 ba. And you'll notice with these patterns, they're not all macrobeat, microbeat. So the first one is just a simple ba, 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 ba. But we don't want to keep them all that way. We want to put those divisions in there. We want to put those division elongations in there. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. I included them in here for you. So when you see those 16th notes, ba, 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 due to data, or ba, 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 that would be a division pattern. And then the syncopation, the ba, 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 that would be a division elongation pattern. We want to include all that in there. That's one of my biggest feedback when I hear people doing patterns and it's all the macrobeat, microbeat. I'm like, give them more. Give them more because they can audiate it. They can audiate it at a young age. So let's see how I would do this with a chant and with providing context, and then the patterns as the content. So let's just do, we're going to do triple meter, and let's stir. I like stirring. Ba, 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 ba. Stir the other way. Ba, 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 ba. Repeat after me. Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. And then back to the whole. We'll stir one more time. Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. Other way. Ba, 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 ba. And the next activity that I have here would be our same and different, which could be very similar to the tonal patterns, same and different. You could do 2 rhythm patterns. Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. And your students would show you same or different. And I forgot to mention about wording. If you do same and different activities, same and different might be a little difficult to understand. So sometimes for students, I'll use same or not the same, or I'll use match or not a match. And to practice the concept visually, which sometimes helps too, just knowing and what those words mean. Sometimes maybe I'll hold up 2 purple egg shakers and I'll say same, and then 2 different ones and I'll talk about how they're different. So same and different. And then you can just kind of fade that out. And you can also give the answers. I didn't mention that as well, but for these same and different activities, you can give the answers even like a split second before the students answer it. And that of course is fine as well.
Krista, there's a question in the Q&A.
Oh, thank you. So how do you help students distinguish the fast notes when clapping a combination? Students seem to usually find the strong beat like the quarter note, but when the 16th notes come, often students miss them in clapping or playing on a rhythm instrument. In person, I can do hand over hand. I miss in person with them to feel the faster notes, but on Zoom, of course, it's harder. So I don't actually have them clap anything in my classes. We chant it. So what I would do is have them make sure that they can vocalize it first. So I would start with a 2 macrobeat pattern. This is exactly what I would do with my students. If my goal is for them to play say on a drum. I don't have a drum. If my goal is for them to play this, which was a do ta dee ta do, right? Ba, 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 ba. The first thing I would have them do is echo it. Can they say that rhythm? Ba, 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 ba. All right. When they can say that rhythm, or I say I do a lot of piano, when they say the rhythm, then I would have them tap it on their body. If they can say it, they can usually tap it. But if your students are still missing them, it just also might not be yet in their vocabularies. So having them chant and start to form a vocabulary of division patterns is going to help them to play it. So, you know, just focusing, you can focus on 2 Macrobeat ones, ba 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 ba, ba 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 ba, ba 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 ba. If they're playing those, they might be able to do 4 Macrobeat ones. I would work towards 4 Macrobeat ones with division patterns, with divisions in them, right? And make sure that they can say them first. If it's a pitched percussion instrument, then what I would do, like if you're teaching piano or anything, if I have a rhythm that a student just cannot get, we stand up, we move, I give them a whole lot of patterns in that function, so in division, and they echo those patterns. And then when they go to the piano, they only play it on 1 key. I don't have them go back to what they're supposed to play it yet. They play it just on 1 key. Then we improvise with it on random keys. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but it works so well. We any keys they can do ba 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 or ba 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 ba. They can do that as well. And then usually when we go back to it, they can play it. So making sure they have a vocabulary in that first is going to be really important. If they haven't really been exposed to many songs with divisions or chants with divisions or patterns with divisions, it's going to be hard to play any kind of patterns with divisions. So making sure that they have the vocabulary is important. Clapping is hard to do. Clapping is a midline thing. I mean, you could do it on your lap, would probably be easier with like bilateral movement, but I think that's what I would do. Make sure they have the vocabulary, make sure that they can echo, make sure they can echo lots of different patterns with those division patterns. And then when you go back to it, it will most likely be a lot better. And then coordination wise too, I don't know what instrument they were playing, but it's really hard to hold 1 stick and go da, 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 da. So when I do piano, when we're doing divisions for the first time, I usually have them go ba, 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 because it's easier than trying to do this fast. So thinking about the coordination of it too, I think will help. I hope that was helpful. Who asked it? Let's see, same and different. Oh, and then this brings me to Macrobeat movement, which might also be helpful. So when you're moving to the beat, right? Because we want them to move to the beat. By the time they're done with informal guidance, where Lucy was in that video, I want them to be able to, I'm going to stand up for this, but this is what I want them to be able to do. I want them to be able to move to the macrobeat, do, and move to the microbeat, do, day, for duple meter, or do-da-dee, 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 do for triple meter. So I want my students to be able to coordinate that movement if I get them early by like 1st grade. This is typically developing students, but we get them there in the same way, no matter what age they are. An adult that can't keep a steady beat, I'd use the same things that I would use with a young student. So how do I get them there? Because that's a really important skill to have if you're going to be playing an instrument or if you're going to be musicking. For Macrobeat movement, you want big movements. Okay, you want big movements. This is going to be hard for Macrobeat movements. So you want to do something like swaying, do. Ba, 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 ba. This is going to help the student feel the space between those big beats. Another movement, if you wanted to hold a beanbag with somebody and go back and forth, or pair a student with a strong macrobeat with one that needs a little bit more guidance, do. Again, there's lots of space between this do, those movements. Tree trunks, do. Those are really good. Again, a lot of space with those. If you have stretchy bands, do. That's another great one. If you're in a band program or you have older students, I like the heels and not the toes, because the heels are going to have weight. We won't wait with that macrobeat. Do, that's what my heel's doing right now. Do on the floor. So there's a lot of different ways to do the macrobeat movement. And if I have a student that can't coordinate both, I take a step back and we practice the macrobeat and microbeat separately in these different ways. And then the microbeat, the small movements, we don't want to stop the movement. So if I put my camera down and I'm tapping like this, if I'm tapping, especially if I'm making a sound, my students know not to make any sounds, the movement is being stopped. We want the movement to keep going when we're doing any kind of beat movement. So sometimes we'll pulse the microbeats. So that's pulsing the microbeats. I did it on my sides before, and that's fine too. There's a little bit of weight to it if you have your arms on the sides like this. And there's still some continuous movement happening there as well. So when you do that microbeat movement, you want that continuous movement between it. I like the pulsing because then you can move your hands as you're doing it. You can have students chant. And if you have a student that can't verbalize it, you have the other students and the teachers and the parents in the room do it. And whisper as you're chanting. All right, so I have 1 minute left. If you want to look at the last page, you have just some teaching tips, and I bet I can go over this in 30 seconds. Generally, I cover these. Responses are not encouraged, they are encouraged. The responses are not expected. Responses are encouraged. Okay, we're supporting our student. Every student is given the opportunity to respond with the least amount of prompting. Be sure to fade any prompts that you're using. Learn from incorrect responses and guide students rather than correct them. For tonal audiation activities, we talked about some of these. You can change tonalities of pitches. This was fun to do, of pitches or familiar songs, and just look at the facial expressions of the students in the room. See who notices the change. You can use pitch percussion or microphones. Let the adults know when to sing and let silence occur too, because you want to give students a chance to audiate and to make their own babbling or echoing or imitating or responses. Rhythm audiation is kind of the same thing. You can read that. And then prompting, I always like to use the least amount of prompting in the classroom. We have our verbal, we have our visual, we have our physical, which you can't do over Zoom. But kind of the sequence that I used to follow was first, if they weren't like playing the instrument, my student wasn't playing an instrument, but I knew that they could, I would just try to get them going, right? So if they were holding the mallet, I would just give them a little nudge and see if that could get them going to play independently, because I wanted them to play. It was more important for me to have them play independently than to have them play right. And then you can help them with the movement. I would sit in front of them playing the drum. I would like to sit in front of them and we would play together so they can watch my movement. And then of course you could have hand over hand. And then I tried to refrain from using verbal prompts just because I liked music to be the primary sound in the environment. So I did very little talking in my classroom, and I still try to do little talking. And then of course, if you have a student that ever gets tense or frustrated, we leave that alone and we stop what we're doing because we want music to be an enjoyable time. And I went 1 minute over, Rhoda.
No worries at all. So thank you, Krista. This was incredibly helpful and informative. Every time I hear you present, I learn more new things. So thank you. We're going to give folks a 5-minute stretch break. And then we're going to come back with my presentation on special education strategies that map really well onto music education. And we're going to say farewell to Krista. Thank you, Krista.
And I put my email address on the handout. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out.
And Krista is going to send me her slides and her handout. They will be attached to the emails I send out on Monday. So
Perfect.
thank you, Krista.
Thank you.
I have 2:32. We're going to come back in 5 minutes when I have 2:37. Stay in the Zoom room. It's so much easier. Just stay where you are. You can turn off your audio and your video. I will be starting promptly in 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone. We'll be starting in 1 minute. All right, so I have 2:37. I'm going to start promptly at this time. So hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking around. Krista's presentation was fantastic. This is a different tack. We're going to be looking at making the special education, music education connection. And so we're going to look at special needs, at diagnoses, at some big picture strategies and frameworks, and then some more on the ground level strategies and frameworks, some specific challenges and ways that music and arts education can address them. And I hope to have plenty of time for questions and so forth in the chat and Q&A, either one is fine. So this is a list of some diagnoses that we know about. There are many, many more. This is an incomplete list. The point is there are lots of diagnoses, lots of different disabilities. There are cognitive, emotional, behavioral, physical, wide range of diagnoses. And if you work in a school setting in the US, you receive documentation about your students and their diagnoses. Sometimes you have students that haven't been diagnosed. Sometimes you're in a teaching situation where you're not privy to diagnosis information. But from my perspective, diagnoses are not really useful for educators. So I do a lot of work with educators at all levels. And I can't tell you all how many times people say to me, boy, if I just knew this student's diagnosis, I would know what to do. I know how to teach them. And there are like 500 things wrong with that statement because there's such a range of expression of diagnoses. So Autism Speaks has the saying, you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. I like to say you've met one student with X disability or diagnosis, you've met one student with X disability or diagnosis. It's quite a wide individual range. So a diagnosis is a useful medical, psychiatric, psychological label for certain purposes, but for educators, the utility is quite limited. Rather than thinking about working with students with disabilities as you learn your diagnosis and there's a recipe, because there isn't, we need to get to know our individual students really, really well and engage in what I call good teaching on steroids. It is the stuff of effective teaching that we know how to do, but we deepen it, we individualize it, we intensify it, and we, what I use the term, steroidify it. So we know from the research that music and people with disabilities, there can be a connection. You will notice throughout this discussion, I will not generalize. I will not say all disabled students, all students with special, I will not go there because of that highly individual expression. So I'll always use language that qualifies, may, can, etc. So some individuals with disabilities and diagnoses have a very powerful connection with music, certainly not all. And it can, for some students, be an area of success, particularly in school, when other aspects of school might be really hard. Here are some things we can be more absolute about. We do know that music as a human activity lights up the entire brain. Functional MRI studies that track the blood flow in the brain have been done with people performing wide ranges of activities and even being in the presence of music. Never mind actually making music or composing music or improvising music, but just being in the presence of music lights up our brain. Our brain is very active. It optimizes our brain function. And one place of particular activity is what's called the corpus callosum, the bridge between the two hemispheres of the brain. So music is this thing that our brains really like. No surprise. We also know that music can affect our heartbeat and our breathing through entrainment. So there have been studies done of choruses where they have found that over time, people who sing together in a chorus end up syncing up heartbeats and respiration in choral rehearsals. It's like everybody sort of gravitates all of their even autonomic functions to the music, which is pretty amazing. We also know that music provides social opportunities, and we know a lot about the music-language connection, although there's more to be learned there. And it's a very exciting field. One thing that I note here is melodic intonation therapy, which is actually a practice that was built in a lab in Boston with Gottfried Schlaug and his colleagues, where people who have lost speech through stroke, or they've also done tests with people with autism who didn't have speech, can either get speech back or get speech for the first time with very intensive long-term work with a therapist that starts with humming, goes to simple, vowels of 1 or 2 pitches, and eventually goes to syllables and words. And when they present their work, it's pretty remarkable. It was founded by various federal organizations, and it's incredible research that they're doing on this particular practice. So there's a great music-language connection. There are some lingering questions in the research. There are many, here are a few. What happens in the brains of people who are prodigies? Something we don't know a lot about. It's a pretty cool phenomenon. We want to understand it more. How does perfect pitch work in our brains? There are studies going on right now about this. And how does musical memory work in our brains? And there's a lot of good research happening. And the music, speech, language web of associations is a really powerful, ripe area for a lot of ongoing research at the moment. And so all of this, of course, has implications for when we teach music. And we will go on. So now sort of big picture, general teaching strategies. You want to link to melodic intonation therapy. So the way to do that is to look up Gottfried Schlaug. I'll put it in the chat. Can I access the chat? I can. Gottfried Schlaug has a lab at, of course it will not let me, it keeps correcting it. There we go. Has a lab at Beth Israel, Deaconess, and Harvard. If you do a Google search there, you will learn all about melodic intonation therapy. You can also Google search that phrase. So moving on, general teaching strategies for students with disabilities. This is what we're going to look at today. Some of this we're going to do real quick, like universal design for learning we've done with Rhiannon, and differentiated instruction we've done with Vicky, but I'll get into these pieces for us today. So accommodations, adaptations, and modifications. These are 3 words that you will see defined differently in different sources. The special education field has a different way of thinking about this than what you're seeing here. What you're seeing here is coming from music educators, Alice Hamill, Ryan Harrigan, and Berta Hickox, and they have written a wonderful book called Winding It Back. And they talk about how this framework in this way plays out for music education. And essentially the idea here is that accommodations are, well, I'll back up. The big distinction among these 3 is in which cases does the student with a disability have the same objectives as the rest of the class, and in which cases is the objective different. So the first 2, everybody's working at the same objective. The third one, the objective is different. So accommodations in this framework are changes that are made to the environment to help everybody access the curriculum. So everybody's doing the same thing, but a student who's visually impaired might have preferential seating. That's an environmental change, one of many. An adaptation Again, we're all working at the same objective, but we are altering, for students who need it, size, color, pacing, or modality. We are delivering our instruction differently. Size could be anything from blowing up the font size for a student with a visual impairment to the amount of work in an assignment, the size of the assignment, right? Color coding is your friend. Using color coding to help students weed through and focus on information that's presented visually. For some students, that can be extremely helpful. Colorblind students, a different challenge, but for students who are not colorblind, for sure. Pacing, slowing way down, lots more wait time, lots more breaks for students to process, giving students additional processing time. Or on the other side, speeding up the pacing for students who are ready to keep moving, giving them what they need to keep moving. Modality goes to our visual, auditory, and kinesthetic modalities. And of course, we want to explore multiple modalities in our teaching. And sometimes a student needs a different modality in order to meet that objective. They can meet the objective, but maybe not in the modality that the other students are doing it in. So that in this framework is an adaptation. Where we change the objective is what's called a modification. So now everybody's working on a task, but a particular student is working on a modified task. So let's say that everybody has to answer all 10 questions on a worksheet, and there's a student who has a different worksheet with 3 questions. You have modified it. You've changed the objective so that that student can achieve at their highest possible level. I see that there's a bunch in the chat, so let's take a look here. Yeah, I'm sorry. I had a lot of trouble with, I tried to write Gottfried with 2 T's and I got autocorrect in chat, so thank you. Great. Fabulous. So moving on. Universal Design for Learning. Spend time with Rhiannon's video. We're not going to go through this because it's not necessary. It is a really important set of teaching approaches, but watch Rhiannon's video for everything you need to know. That was sent out to you after the UDL session, which was in March. Differential Instruction, watch Vicky's presentation from this morning. Much more detail on how to differentiate than we need here. Moving to new things. Multiple learning modalities. So we all already know that there is the visual modality, the auditory modality, the kinesthetic modality. Most of us gravitate towards one or the other of these. Some people have a couple that are really strong for them. The best teaching engages more than one. Learning is going to stick better if we have multiple modalities involved in learning. A few things that are a little bit different. I have learned in my work over the years that arts teachers tend to privilege the modality that dominates their art form. So all of the art forms are multimodal, but they all also have a dominant modality, right? Visual arts has a dominant modality of the visual. Music has a dominant modality of the auditory. The other modalities are engaged for sure, but the auditory modality dominates. Arts teachers tend to privilege that dominant modality. And I think that's because arts teachers are usually artists, and that dominant modality is the way that they're used to communicating. It's the dominant modality of their work. So it becomes the dominant modality of their teaching. And that's something to understand and be aware of and to counteract by finding opportunities to take advantage of the other modalities. And I would argue that the visual modality in teaching is the most important modality. And I will tell you why. When something happens auditorially, it is temporary unless you've recorded it. So if you give an instruction by telling your students the instruction, when you're done speaking, that instruction is gone. And you will have the students who need extra processing time, or who have had trouble focusing, who have something else going on in their life, or who for whom English is not their first language, whatever it might be, who are going to need you to provide that instruction again and again. If the instruction is also written out visually, that visual representation stays there. It's not temporary. So you have immediate extra supports that are going to stick around. Similarly, if you're showing students something to do kinesthetically, let's say in a dance class, wonderful, or you're showing them kinesthetically how to hold mallets or how to put together a clarinet, whatever it might be. That's great that you got them involved kinesthetically, but once they've finished that kinesthetic involvement, there isn't a support waiting around to help them. The visual modality combined with that gives you supports, and it gives supports that last, that students can reference at their own pace. So I can't underscore enough the power of the visual modality. Vicki talked about this morning. I'll talk about it briefly. The concept of fair does not mean equal. And this is a concept that is really born of inclusive education. It was not a concept when I was in school. The idea is that fair does not mean giving every single student the exact same thing. Rather, it means giving each student what they need in order to succeed in the class or at the particular task at hand. And that might be different for different people. So I have a couple of graphics to show you about that. This is the graphic that Vicki showed this morning. There are 3 images here. The objective is the same across all 3 images, and that is that we want to watch the baseball game. And if any of you know that right now the Red Sox are in first place in the American League East, so I really want to watch the baseball game because I'm a big Red Sox fan. So there you go. So in the first 2 images, we have a fence that is made of wood. And in the third image, we have a fence that's made of mesh. And that separates the spectators that we're thinking about from the game. So in the first image, all 3 people are given the same thing, equal. Each person has 1 square, 1 block to stand on. But all 3 of them are not able to reach the objective. In the second image, they are given different things. 1 person doesn't get anything, 1 person gets 2 blocks. And now all of them can see the baseball game over the wall. In the third image, we eliminate the barrier of the wooden fence, and we don't even need to worry about giving supports because we have eliminated that barrier. So that is the sort of first level interpretation of this image. I want to add another layer just as a caveat here. One thing that's been brought up about this set of graphics is that the person who needs more support in order to succeed at this task is drawn in these pictures as smaller, right? The shorter person, the smaller person needs more support. And that sends a message that needing additional support makes one always lesser than, or less important, or less significant in relation to others. And that's a message we don't want to send. And I don't think that was the intention of the people who created this graphic, but it's something that folks, when they interpret it, have pointed out, and I think it's a caveat worth noting as we look at this. Another graphic that I use for fair does not mean equal also needs a caveat, but once you get past the caveat, I love this graphic. Fair is not always equal. Teaching is a lot like doctoring. Okay, now my antennae have gone up and I'm getting to the caveat, because teaching is not as simple as going to the doctor. I recently had an allergic reaction. I went to the doctor, I got medication, I got better. Teaching is not, teacher plus X equals curing someone. And there's also an underlying idea about curing people, which we don't want to get at, especially with people with disabilities. We are not about trying to find cures. So the doctoring thing makes me a little uncomfortable. But if I get past that and read through the rest of the graphic with the caveats around doctoring, I really like what they're trying to do here. So bear with me. Kids go to a doctor with different needs, and we have a scraped knee and stomach pain and a broken arm and a cough. But if the doctor gave the same thing, cough syrup in this example, to every student, only one would get what they need, right? Only the one with the cough. And that's not fair. It's the same thing in a classroom. Every student has different needs. I have trouble focusing for more than 15 minutes. I think better when my hands are busy. I can talk about what I know better than I can write about it. I can't grip a pen or a pencil. So different students should get different things to help them succeed. The first student should get classroom breaks and tests taken over multiple days. The second student should get fidget toys and tactile activities. The third student should be able to create a video instead of composing a paper. And the fourth student should get a modified writing utensil or writing on a computer instead. So giving those individualized supports, right? And that's what makes a classroom fair for everyone. So careful with the caveat around doctoring, but I really like the message and the way that it's trying to put forward that we can't just give everybody cough syrup. It's not going to work. So I submit that for your approval. Teaching strategies in a group setting, a bunch of important ones: structure and schedule, keeping instructions simple and clear, using other modalities, allowing students to practice and prepare in advance, giving students digital video and audio recordings of material that you're going to work on in advance, modifying projects and exams and assignments when necessary to include less material but the same expectations, having students perform only what they can contribute to a meaningful performance. So if this particular student has all the B flats and the Fs on the trumpet really good, but doesn't have the other pitches, they don't have to play the other pitches. Have them play the pitches that they play best where they appear in the piece. And the rest of it, they'll contribute to it later. And then there's the phenomenon of social stories, which Vicki mentioned, and I told her that I was going to get into this afternoon. So around schedule and structure, we haven't yet talked about anxiety. So let me take a moment and talk about anxiety. Anxiety is on the rise in the human race, as we all know. It is on the rise in schools and school communities, which I know we've all seen. And if a student has a disability or a diagnosis, there's often a lot of anxiety because there's a school is a situation where they're put in all kinds of situations they're not prepared for. Going to new spaces, will they be able to maneuver in those spaces? Will they be told that they aren't doing something right and they don't really understand what the expectations are, right? School is hard. So anxiety is a big part of a lot of people's lives. And one way to help with anxiety is that every person likes to know what's going to happen before it happened. The first slide I showed you after the title slide was our agenda for today, right? Because this is what's going to happen. So when I talk about structure with teachers who are working with students with disabilities, I don't only mean just put the agenda on the board. I mean put the agenda on the board and really use it. In this private lesson example that we see here, the teacher wrote the different songs. This is a voice student who's doing some Andrew Lloyd Webber and a little bit of Sondheim and a few other things here. And each item on the agenda has a box, and the student actually checks off the box after they've done each item on the agenda. In a class setting, you have the agenda on the whiteboard and you say, this is what we're going to do today. You walk the class through the agenda, and then as you do each thing, you telegraph it. We're going to do this now. Okay, we finished doing this. Now we're moving on to the next thing. That kind of explaining and using and telegraphing the agenda can really help a lot of students who have challenges because of anxiety. I've also talked with a lot of teachers about this is sort of a micro schedule. It's each activity. You can also have consistency in the macro flow of how lessons happen in your space. I was working with a Berklee faculty member who had a student who was clearly quite anxious. And I talked with him about it's not always possible, but whenever possible, having sort of a standard structure to how a class period goes. Start with the homework, then we go on to something very familiar, then we learn the big lesson of the day, lots of brand new things, and we end with something familiar that people can walk out feeling successful, and we have a ticket to leave of some sort. So he adapted a strategy like that, a structure like that for his class. And after sticking to that for several class sessions, the student who was anxious became less anxious. And you didn't have to communicate, you didn't have to say that to the group, this is my big picture structure. Just by having things feel the same way, the room is set up the same way when the students come in. The overall big flow feels the same. It alleviates students' anxiety. They come to know what to expect. So schedules are really important. Back to these points, keeping instructions simple and clear, and partnering them with multiple modalities. Like I said, preparatory materials, again, helps with anxiety. Performing only what a student can. So rather than a lot of really well-meaning music teachers who have a student with a disability, say in an ensemble setting, and don't know what to do, don't know what to have them do, really struggle with how to have the student have an authentic music making experience. It might be that they can't sing or play the entire piece, that they will sing and play instead what they can contribute effectively, and have other, either by resting or by participating in other ways along with their classmates, to continue to contribute. And then the last is social stories. So social stories are preparatory narratives that help students prepare for a new experience or learn a new routine, or do something that they might never have done before. And the idea is that it's an opportunity for the students to walk through what that experience is going to entail, to see that they might be nervous about it, and that there's nothing wrong with being nervous about it, and that it's all going to go well. So sort of walking themselves through it. So here I have two examples of social stories. On the left is a social story that is made with the Board Maker program with icons, and it's the routine of how to walk to an assembly, and it shows step by step what the students are expected to do. On the right-hand side is a text social story about a first recital. On Sunday at 10 a.m., I'm having my first recital at Capitol Conservatory. I will listen politely when Anna and Bob perform and clap when they are finished. Then it will be my turn to play my songs. I am nervous about my first recital. This is okay. All musicians are nervous at their first recital. I will be happy and proud of myself when I am finished. So this is text only. So it's probably for an older student, but the idea is, here's what's going to happen. Here's sort of step by step, and you can get more granular. You can say, I will go to this place. I will sit in the front row. I mean, you can be as granular as you want in terms of the steps. And the point about I am nervous and this is okay. All musicians are nervous at their first recital. It normalizes the fact that we have feelings, that a new situation, a situation like this would make us nervous. Nothing wrong with that. And then at the end, happy and proud of myself when I am finished. So what's not here? I got all the notes correctly. My teacher told me I gave the best performance she ever heard. The audience gave me a standing ovation. I met the district determined measures in my school district. None of that is there. Instead, we go through the experience and the student's going to perform, right? And then they're happy and proud when they finished, because it's a great accomplishment to perform at your first recital, right? So the social stories are from the perspective of the participant. They can be icons and text. They can be text only. They can be just pictures. They can be videos. We've done a lot of video social stories to help people prepare for performances, as well as to help people prepare if they have to go to another site to give a performance, what that's going to look like, and the perspective of walking into that place and what you'll see can be really, really helpful as a preparatory tool to alleviate anxiety and help people get ready for a new experience. I recommend having social stories well in advance of the event, because students should be able to reference them multiple times. And most students really like to, because it helps them think about this thing that they're anxious about and helps them get ready for it. So those are some bigger picture strategies. Before we get into the next level down, are there questions or anything I can respond to? I'll give you a little bit of time to write anything in the chat that you might have. If I can see the chat. When you share your screen, aha, here we go. Good. Now I can see the chat. Just making sure we're okay. Okay, I'm going to go on, and if questions come in, we will take them later. So now we're down from the bigger picture level, down a level, to a few more granular special education, music education strategies and connections. I talk a lot about the two-way street. So we are music educators, and we want to provide music education experiences, knowledge, skills, opportunities for all of our students. And that is an incredible thing that we get to do every day. In addition, our students with disabilities have certain challenges that they deal with in their lives. And there are some things that when we do them in music class, they also help those students with their challenges. So for example, there's something called joint attention, the idea that multiple people are all paying attention to one thing. So if we were all in the same room, we'd all be paying attention to the screen or the whiteboard at the same time. You'd all be paying attention to me, right? That different people are all looking at the same thing. For some students with cognitive challenges, figuring out where to put attention and understanding that there's lots of people here and they're all looking at this thing right now because that's the focus of the discussion or the focus of the activity can be challenging. In music, we do this all the time. In ensemble rehearsals, we're all looking at measure 42. We're all looking at the conductor. In a general music class, we're all watching perhaps the student who is performing or watching the teacher who is demonstrating, right? So there's, I mean, we could go on and on. If we're passing the ball around the circle, we're watching the ball as it gets passed around the circle. So we are practicing that joint attention skill all the time. So we're helping our students in that additional aspect, as well as, of course, the wonderful musical piece. So that's why I think of it as a two-way street. I talked about good teaching on steroids. Really, this is not an additional toolkit. It is a toolkit we already have, but we have to think about it differently. It is definitely a shift in our thinking, and we have to use those tools in a deeper, more personalized, more intensive way. We can modify exams, assignments, and projects to include less material, but keep the expectations the same. We have a student perform only what they can contribute to a meaningful performance. And then we go into the big three: task analysis, discrete trial teaching, and prompts and fading. So task analysis. Task analysis is the act of taking a task and breaking it down to teach it. This is something that good teachers do all the time. When I was learning how to drive, I was not a kid who went go-karting or who drove little mini cars. I had a bicycle, that was about it. So when I was learning how to drive, my father sat me behind the wheel before I had had driver's ed and said, okay, go ahead and start. And it was too much for me to do at once. So we started off where he steered and I just did the pedals. I was just doing the feet. And then after a while, he did the pedals and I just steered. Got the hang of that. Then we put it together and, not too long after at the same session, I was doing both. So he was a good teacher. He broke down the task of steering and using the pedals into two pieces and had me do one, then the other, then put it together. The difference, the steroids piece, the good teaching on steroids piece, is that the pieces now for task analysis are much, much smaller. So you're breaking it down in the smallest little teeny tiny chunks, because if the chunks are too big, it's going to be too much for the student to get their arms around and to be able to do and to be able to practice. And you do want to combine the chunks, but if you combine them too soon, the student won't be able to do it. So it's a much, much slower process. So here's an example in music. I remember when I started piano lessons when I was younger. I was, I think, 8 or 9 years old. And my first lesson, she taught me how to place my right hand on the keys, showed me the proper hand position, and I was playing simple 5-note C, D, E, F, G patterns on the keys very early on, very quickly in my first lesson. For a student with disabilities, for whatever reason, could be a physical disability, could be a cognitive disability, whatever disability, it might be a whole lot of lessons just knowing where to put your thumb. We might be working with just the thumb for a long time until the thumb feels really good, and then we do the thumb and one other finger. So we've slowed the pacing way down, and we've chunked that putting the 5 fingers on the keyboard way, way down into its smallest pieces. So the sort of key words for task analysis are the steps. What are the steps, each individual little step that a student needs to follow to complete a task? I see something in the chat. I'm glad that you like the idea of a macro schedule. Small chunks give us a sense of accomplishment. You bet. That's a big part of it. If the chunks are too big, you're going to get frustration and you're going to get someone giving up. That's absolutely true. And I think, Navita, that's a great point you're making. And I think one way to think about task analysis is imagine yourself as a beginner. I like to try new things and learn them and get in touch with my inner beginner. For a long time, I was taking golf lessons and I was a real beginner at that. And thinking about, because in music, we're not beginners. But if you think about a place where you can be a beginner, and then for our students with disabilities, we need even smaller chunks than we might need, right? So really, really important around task analysis. The next piece is discrete trial teaching. And we heard little bits of this in Vicky's and Krista's sessions today. But discrete trial teaching is really around getting to errorless mastery, getting to a point where you have mastered something to the point where it is automatic. There are many things we do in music automatically. Hand positions, muscle memory for fingerings, naming the lines and spaces on the staff in whatever clef or clefs we're using, lots and lots of things, remembering lyrics to songs, muscle memory around breath control. You can think of a lot of things that we have to do without thinking, because in music, our attention is in a lot of different places. If you play an instrument like I do, like the piano, you need to have automaticity because you can't pay equal attention to both hands. So there needs to be automaticity allowing that. And if you're playing the organ and doing quadruped stuff, or playing percussion and doing quadruped stuff, there's got to be automatic there because your whole brain can't be in 4 places at once. So the idea here is that we have this small piece and we've got to get it mastered, and it's got to be consistent, and we got to not feel frustrated, as Navita was saying. So the biggest mistakes we make are that we don't practice it long enough, or that mastery is not consistent. There are great ensemble directors I know who will rehearse something with a choir or a band and say, okay, that was perfect. We need to do it 3 times in a row that perfectly without stopping. Then I know we've got it. And that's a great test. I think for our students with disabilities, it needs to be more than 3 times. I think we might need to see that we can do it 5 times in a row without stopping. Is that mastery really consistent? Is that skill really automatic? Is it going to stay with them, or are they going to need to keep practicing it? Even though they did it consistently for us, we might need to continue that practice, because the next time we see them, will it still be automatic? I don't know. We have to make sure we get enough practice in. Prompts and fading, you heard a little bit about this in both sessions earlier today as well. It's a big piece of the work here. And the idea is that you start the student with supports, and you very, 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 very slowly and gradually eliminate portions of them until the student can do the task unsupported. I have a couple of great examples of this. So I was working with music teachers in Lynn, Massachusetts a couple of years ago, and one of the teachers raised her hand. She teaches keyboard classes at the middle school and the high school. And she said, I don't know what to do. I've got these students with disabilities in my keyboard classes and they're failing and I don't know what to do. So I had her walk me through sort of what she's been working on with them. So they've been working on a piece. in C major. And at the very beginning, when they get the piece, they're allowed to write the note names, the letter names of the notes underneath the notes. It's a one-hand piece. So they write the letter names under the notes. And they get to practice it that way. And then after a couple of weeks, she asks them to erase all the letters, and they have to be able to play the piece. Well, the problem here was that all of the supports were taken away. We went from 60 to 0. We didn't have any gradual steps along the way. So I said to her, how about with the students that are having trouble, instead of erasing all of the letter names, the pieces in C, once they've gotten good playing it, have them erase all the C's, but keep all the other letters there. And then maybe we erase all the G's. You see where I'm going. This is in the C major chord, right? They erase all the G's. Now the C's and the G's are gone, but everything else is there. And very, very gradually like this, until it's going to take some time, but they need those supports to stick around as you're very slowly what's called fading the prompt. So that's a really good example. And when she did try that, her students did much better. Of course they did, because they didn't have to go from 60 to 0. Another wonderful example, I love telling this story. Years ago, before this individual even knew what prompts and fading were, she was a former student of mine, was teaching private piano lessons in the Berklee Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs. And she had a student with perfect pitch who was on the autism spectrum. And this student didn't want to read music to begin with, but she was working on music reading with him. And he was having a lot of trouble with the musical alphabet. We all know in music, we use the letters A to G, and then we keep looping those letters. Well, this student had nothing of it. He didn't want to do that. He wanted after G to say the letter H, and he kept hounding this. And she was like, I don't know what to do. Well, she came up with an idea that I think is a wonderful example of prompts and fading. She took a strip of construction paper and wrote the letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Took that strip, fastened the two ends, and turned it into a bracelet. He would put it on his wrist. They would start at a note that he would understand and be able to identify. And then she would point to another note and he'd say, oh, that's up 3. So we were on C and I go up 3, and he would turn the bracelet, D, E, F. So now he could find the note, right? So he used the bracelet that way for quite some time. And then he got really good at finding C. So she gave him a new bracelet. It had A, B, empty space, D, E, F, G. And she fastened the ends, and that was a new bracelet. And now he didn't need the C, but there was an empty space there, and he used the bracelet for everything else. And little by little, he started to identify more and more notes on the staff correctly without the support. And he got a new bracelet every time, until his last bracelet had, you guessed it, G and A on it, because that was, of course, the sticking point. And eventually he got that too. And now he continues to study piano, reads all the lines and spaces beautifully, and doesn't need a bracelet. So she created beautiful prompts and faded them very gradually. So I love that story. I think it's a fantastic example. So the biggest mistakes we make here with prompts and fading are taking too many supports away, going from 60 to 0, like the keyboard example, or taking the supports away too quickly, right? So if she had changed bracelets every week with him, it would have been too fast. So think about how we can use prompts and fading in our teaching. Another wonderful component to think about has to do with assessment. And this relates to the assessment presentation that I gave 2 weeks ago. And that is winding it back. This is a concept put forward by Alice Hamill, Ryan Harrigan, and Berta Hickox-Yee. And it is about how we think about meeting our students where they are. So here's the lesson we're teaching our class. We've got a student who isn't quite at that level yet. We have to go back to reach that person in the sequence of our work. so that we get to that student's sweet spot, that wonderful zone of proximal development space that between what someone can do independently and what someone can do with support, right? So where is that sweet spot? And then customizing the work for that student and the supports for that student in that place. This is the steroidification that is required when it takes knowing your students really well. And that takes time, especially for us in music who don't see our students every day and don't have lots of time with them. It takes time to get to know our students well and how they learn. But the plus we have that our colleagues don't have is we see our students for multiple years. So we get to know them as learners very well over a longer time frame. But watching our students, observing how they learn, observing where they're at, and meeting them there to find that sweet spot. The same is true with differentiated instruction for individuals who are moving more quickly than the class, finding where they are and helping them to find the place of next challenge, right? And giving them that, the support that they need and the resources that they need for that. Here are some of the different kinds of challenges that our students with disabilities face. Theory of mind challenges. Theory of mind is the understanding that every individual person has their own way of thinking, their own experiences, and their own perspectives. So some people with disabilities have trouble understanding the differences in people's perspectives or taking another person's perspective. I love thinking about music education with theory of mind because when you learn everybody else's part, if you're in an ensemble or you learn other people's parts, you are learning other perspectives on that piece, on that work that you're doing, which is a wonderful way that music can help with theory of mind. Central coherence. Central coherence is about forest and trees. It's about details versus the big picture. So this is often true with people with autism, but it can also be true with people with different kinds of processing challenges, sensory processing challenges, that taking in all the sensory input, it's hard to filter what's important, what's the most important thing, what's less important. Instead, everything all is big and demanding a lot of attention. So helping to figure out where the focus should be is it can be very hard for some students. In music, we do this all the time in terms of what we're focusing on, like I said before, in terms of looking at measure 32, looking at the conductor, looking at your hands, looking at the person who's modeling, looking at your classmate who's passing the ball, whatever it might be. Executive function is a term that a lot of people know, and it's really about planning and preparing for complex events and situations, and checklists and social stories like the one with the procedure to the to go to the assembly, and other kinds of icons that show a process and how it unfolds can be really helpful for students. Keeping our language literal. So prepositions are really hard. We don't say in our programs that notes are on the space, on a line or in a space. We don't say that. Because if you are super literal, a line runs through a note when we call it on the line. In music, we call it on the line, but literally the line's running through it. So we call them line notes and space notes, right? To make that clear, because abstract thinking and abstract concepts can be difficult, and music is full of a lot of them. Dynamics can be really challenging. A lot of our students with disabilities just like to play loud. The physical sensation of playing loud, the sensory input of creating loud music is something that feels good. And the idea that there are different dynamic levels and that they have certain regions of dynamics that correspond with them can be very abstract. So instead, we might color code different aspects of dynamics. We might give them numbers. We might use a story to go along with music and have that. Is this a part of the story where they're speaking quietly? Well, then we need to play quietly. Is this a part of the story where they're speaking loudly? You get the idea. And the challenges with that can be significant, and we can really help with those in music class. You should really watch Vicky's video from this morning about behavioral challenges, because she talks a whole lot about them. Here are some behaviors that you might see. Outbursts, meltdowns, tantrums. So outbursts are a momentary outburst, a momentary expression. A meltdown, people with autism and other disabilities have described meltdowns to me as so much overload, often sensory overload, but it can be cognitive overload, that it's like a computer. The operating system just shuts down and you melt down. A tantrum is different. A tantrum is an expression, often because you want something or you want something to stop, different from a meltdown, and those are often confused. Anxiety, we talked about earlier. Odd or repetitive behavior and things like stimming. We don't want to stop a student who needs to stim if it's not hurting anybody or too distracting for the class. We should find a way to let it continue rather than stopping the stimming. Behavior relates to social skills, and social skills can be really hard. And Vicky talked a lot about the purpose behind behavior and the communication of behavior, as well as its ABCs. We also see physical challenges, a wide range of mobility challenges, fine and gross motor challenges, balance and motor planning. Motor planning is a biggie. So if you have to get from here to here, how do you do that? Where do you go? Why would you go one way and not another way? How do you figure that out? What are the steps? It's related to executive function in that way. You can also see visual impairment and hearing impairment for sensory deficits. You can also see tactile impairment as well, or olfactory impairment as well. And then there's hyper and hyposensitivity. And all of these are challenges that we might see. And we can address them very well, as I've talked about, with music and the arts. I've left us a good amount of time for discussion. I'm going to stop the share and be available in the chat and Q&A for any discussion that, or any questions that have come up from what we went over this afternoon. So I will give it a little moment. Lisa, you're raising your hand. So that's really hard to do because I can't, can you type you've got a bunch of people. So I love that you've raised your hands. It's not easy for me to, in webinar to, let's see if I can, yeah, I don't even know who raised their hand. That's crazy that they won't tell me that. Okay, Lisa, I see you. Let me see if I can get you to talk. Here you are. You are now permitted to speak.
Oh, wow. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to mention in the behavior, kind of bridging the behavior in the medical, I've been reminded recently about seizures. I used to see them a lot when I worked with older students, but a couple of my now puberty-esque students have been having them. And they do tend to present, especially at the beginning of their, when they're occurring with the students, as a behavior. So, you know, sort of as a blanking out, or, I mean, I've seen it in a couple of different ways, but I just wanted to bring that up as something that we all should be aware of, especially if you're working with students on the autism spectrum. It occurs frequently.
There is a fair amount of comorbidity between autism and epilepsy or any kind of seizure disorder. It's true. That's something actually that I know someone who's doing some great laboratory research on why that is, what that has to do with how we're wired. But you're right, it's something to keep an eye out for. And seizures can have different expressions. A petit mal seizure might just look like someone's daydreaming. whereas we all are probably more familiar with seizures that are more physically manifested. Thank you, Lisa. That's a great point. I'm going to mute your microphone again. Now, I'm wondering who the other person is who raised their hand. It does not say here who that is. I looked at the panelist list and it's not showing me. Participants list, it's not showing me. One attendee is raising their hand and I can't find who it is. If you are that person, can you identify yourself in the chat? I think we're doing okay. And if there are any other questions or comments around what we discussed today, Navita, I have a Zoom music class that has not been divided age appropriately. Oh, goodness gracious. Putting together kindergarten and first grade at very different learning levels with difficult internet connections and kids together in a classroom with masks. I'm looking for ways to bring this together better. I want to challenge the first graders, but not leave the kindergarten students behind. So let me make sure I understand. Maybe Navita, I can get you unmuted also. Am I able to do that? Yes, now you can talk. Unless for some reason it just muted again. Let me unmute you. There.
There we go. Okay. Yes, I do have this challenge that I have this class. Ultimately, the class is built around composing a piece of music together.
Okay.
But it's after school. I mean, if I've just been
Right against you.
Yes, yeah, and poor internet connection and very little light in the classroom, and a teacher a classroom teacher that I have to encourage to sit with the class, and I can barely see all the students. And if I put the kindergartners in the front, I wanted to have them sit on chairs, or excuse me, on the floor, because then I can see so much better. But that was nixed. So they're sitting in big chairs with feet kicking back and forth. And I had the kindergartners in the first row, but the level of restlessness, and I think also they couldn't follow. So if I had so I put them sort of in the second row and try to put them in the windows, so that I could see everybody, which doesn't always happen because chairs move. But yeah. I'm worried about two of the kindergartners in particular, that they're getting a little bit left behind, and having the first graders who can go, move things forward in the front row, I think has helped a little bit so that the kindergartners can follow along. But and also I don't have consistency. Sometimes I'll have 15 kids, and then the next time I meet them, there'll be 9. So there's a lot of challenges, but I just really want to make sure that I include those. Oh, and we're supposed to have instruments, but they haven't arrived yet.
And are you doing this in person?
No, I'm on Zoom.
You're on Zoom. And they're all in the same room and you're Zooming to them?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So that's tricky because you can't really do breakout rooms.
No, cannot.
The first place I go is cooperative peer-assisted learning. Get some first graders and some kindergartners together, and you able to check on all of them, and sort of negotiate all that. But you don't have the technology to do that.
I don't have the technology, unfortunately.
Okay. Why is the objective to write a piece of music?
That's what I'm a teaching artist, and this residency, that is what the residency is about.
Okay. So they're supposed to come up with a product at the end that's a class piece that they've all written?
It will be, yes, the residency asks me to help them compose a piece of music, and then we bring a professional musical. I will transcribe it into notes. We're not using music reading. I'm using things like, an apple and a pineapple and a grape, a bunch of grapes, so that we understand 1 sound, 2 sounds, 3 triplets. And then I'm also working with story, because that's that's where I come from. So we're creating some sort of story, and then I will transcribe what we do, and we will bring in a professional musician to play, and they will hear their piece.
Got it. I love the idea. I've seen there's similar work that I'm aware of, like classroom cantatas in Boston that does a similar kind of thing. I love that. So
Yes.
where I go is, how kinesthetic is your class? How much are they getting up and moving?
I get them up moving as much as possible, breaking things up. I only have an hour, and that is if they arrive in the classroom in time. Usually with this group, so far, I really only get about 40 minutes by the time we move desks, which and sit in 2 rows, and get the internet working. So, but I do get them up to move, and one of the big things that I do is I play the piano, so I play music. I play some music, jumping music, and listening and turning music, so they have to listen with the back of their ears. They can't see my hands playing.
Sure. So let me ask a question. Why do
Yes.
you think these 2 particular kindergartners are being left behind? What is the clue that you're getting from them?
I just don't see the level of participation.
But that could be for all kinds of reasons, Navita.
Yes. And I don't know anything about these children either.
And that's
I've
the
been
hard
given-
thing about being a teaching artist. You're coming in, you're coming in blind and cold. So it could be that they are that this is the way they best participate, that they are actually engaged in our learning, but you can't see it. It could be that there's anxiety happening. It could be that it's too easy. It could be that it's too hard and confused. We don't know. There's too many, and you don't even get a chance to pull them aside because it's you and this group, right? So give me an example of how their participation looks different from other kindergartners in the group.
I mean, it is partly age appropriate, you know. They are, we're at the end of the day, and they are, you know, kindergartners. They're exhausted.
5, of course they are.
Yeah, they're 5, and they're small, and they're sitting in big chairs. Their feet don't touch the ground. They're ungrounded. I mean, but I think I see a tremendous amount of restlessness and not following along. Like, and I try to give turns. We go, you know, to each person, which will, and I think things will get better once we get the instruments, if we get the instruments. We're already halfway through the residency, and the instruments have not arrived.
There may be an opportunity here for the macro structure idea, because what you might be seeing is anxiety. It's possible. We don't know these students. I'm guessing you don't know these students, but anxiety is a thing for so many folks. And sometimes what looks like not engaged or sometimes defiant, so that's not what you're describing, is actually anxiety based. So I would look at keeping your macro structure more similar from session to session, and communicating and telegraphing that structural agenda every bit, all the time. And you already know this, it sounds like. I mean, I was going to give you advice like, for very young students, we need to switch the activities very quickly. You know that, because we do. They can't spend much time on one thing. But it sounds like you know that, and you've got them moving, which is great. I think it's probably something that will alleviate itself as they get accustomed to more of a similar flow and routine.
Great, that's helpful, you know. And I'm reading more and more music and movement into into the 45 minutes. I'm going to start doing something in which the 2 children move down. We're doing something with an idea of where I went walking and what did you see, based on a book, and getting kids to make sounds. You know, taking words away now and making sounds instead of words, you know, moving from word-based language to musical language.
Yes.
Yeah. And I do have a strong macro structure. So, I mean, maybe it's just the best that it's going to be. And the other issue is that I can't
Remember
read
this,
faces.
Navita,
Yeah.
remember this. Participation looks different for every person. And Rachel put that in the chat, and she's right. And as I was saying, for some people, that may be their best participation, especially a 5-year-old at the end of the day. So I think you need to give yourself a little bit of a break, because this may be their best participation, and that's great.
Thank you. Thank you for that encouragement. And I like what's said in the chat too. Thank you so much.
There's some great ideas in the chat. Thank you, Navita, for bringing this up. This is fantastic. Any other comments or questions in the chat? Thank you, Chris, for that suggestion for Navita as well. I love all the suggestions. The whole Zoom thing adds so many layers to this, beyond our expectations, for sure. I'm going to give it another minute or two, and then we'll move to close, but I don't want to make sure if there's anybody else. Looks like we are in a good place. So thank you all for your time and participation today. I will be putting out the email on Monday with all of the slides from everybody who presented today, either in the earlier session or this afternoon, including Krista's handout as well as the links to the Google Docs and all the other materials so that you have everything that you need. I want to thank you for your participation and your time and your attention, and wish you a wonderful rest of your weekend and a wonderful week. And we will be back together 2 weeks from now to see everyone's projects. Remember that the project presentations will be short. We are going to keep them very short, under 5 minutes, because we have so many. And that's a wonderful problem to have. But I thank you in advance for thinking about a very short highlight. It won't be all the work, I know, but a very short highlight. Yes, we'll be able to have people talk for the presentations, Navita, but like I've been saying, they're going to be super duper short. And I'm going to have to do the awful thing that we all hate about stopping people and keeping fair time, because we have a lot of folks who want to present. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day. You're wondering if you'll be on camera. I can share speaking. I don't believe I can share yourself on video, but in the webinar, yes, I can. Okay, it looks like I can share you on video. So if you need to be seen while you're talking, that will be fine. We can do it that way. Great. Thank you all. Have a wonderful couple of weeks. We'll be in touch on Monday.